to the startup grind.
The other side of the pond. Startup grind, I guess for the people who haven't been before. Hey.
Mic up. Yeah.
Further up?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Startup grind for people who haven't been before. Global now, I guess, in 45 cities. It's a fireside chat series that's been going about 4 years. We relaunched in New York at the beginning of this year. And I think this is our 5th event in. This is going to be, I think, a great one. We've got Esther Dyson with us, which is fantastic. What we try and do at these events is really just get lessons learned from successful entrepreneurs and investors on really how best to approach entrepreneurship and really sort of build their businesses. New York being a thriving ecosystem, I think there are different sort of specificities that go with this particular city, and we'll try and draw some of that out. I think we've got a really interesting perspective that Esther can share, insofar as she's probably one of the most globally sort of aware investors that I know. Actually, we didn't talk about this before, but I think I first came across Esther through a friend who, Charlie Muirhead?
Oh yeah.
Right. Okay, so I mean, you can probably sort of share when you sort of met up with Charlie, but that was in the 90s in London, and that was well before I moved to the States full time. But the idea of actually an American investor actually really sort of diving into the London startup ecosystem was definitely something that kind of inspired me, and I think you'll hear more about the work that Esther's done globally, internationally, and in different sectors. I'm probably going to put this down. I'd love to, but yes, let's get started. And again, thank you very much for coming. Yeah, I think we're wrong with that. Yeah. Wow. That's a quick question. I think right from the beginning, as I said, is that okay? Or should I?
Yeah, a little bit higher. Right.
You really want to hear?
Yeah, I needed that. and point it towards you if you can. Just put angle towards you.
Okay.
If you want.
No, that's fine. It's fine. I think I can do that.
We don't have enough for.
Is that all right?
It's a little better. Angle it towards you. If you point it away, it's very narrow direction. There you go. Point a little bit, the face of it towards you. There you go.
Tilted.
Perfect.
Yes?
Yeah, that's much better.
How does that work?
That's good.
Okay, I'll keep it here.
It's trying to avoid listening to people on the side of you.
Okay. I think a quick question. What kind of inspired you to, I guess before becoming an investor, to really sort of set out and kind of travel and work internationally? Did you start off in New York?
No, I'm actually an immigrant, not your typical one, but I was born in Switzerland. My mother was Swiss, my father was English, and my stepmother was German. And until I was 12 years old, I was an obnoxious little Anglophile until I went, and only British people say across the pond. I went across the pond. I wanted to live in England, and so I persuaded my parents to let me stay with this other family that were friends of theirs. And it was a wonderful year, but it wasn't as wonderful as I expected, and I was very glad to come home. So I fulfilled my dream and learned a lot, but I also began to appreciate the U.S. Then when I was 17, so I went to college when I was 16. When I was 17, I dropped out because I wasn't very hardworking. And I went to live in Morocco with my boyfriend, who was in the Peace Corps. And had a wonderful time. Then I went back and worked in London for 6 months later on, and my goal in life is to become a Moscow correspondent for probably the New York Times. I had learned Russian in high school, but I never got around to it. And I did, in fact, live in Russia for 6 months training as a cosmonaut. So I like traveling, and I think it gives you a really good perspective, especially on the U.S. In Russia, almost nothing works, and so I appreciate being in the United States more. I spend a lot of time, not just in normal places like London, but in fact in India and Russia. They won't let me into China anymore, but when they did, that was interesting.
Actually, I was going to ask you about China, but you've worked with, I guess, sort of WPP,
yeah. Which is the big advertising marketing company.
And Eurasia as well?
Eurasia Foundation.
That's not Ian Bremmer, is that
no,
the same guy?
That's a different thing.
Okay, all right.
But I'm on the board of Yandex, which is loosely called the Google of Russia, though it got started a year before Google. And I have a couple of investments, one in South Africa, one in Kenya, and then the normal British ones. And
is the bulk of what you're investing in now in kind of early stage tech, and within tech is it kind of healthcare tech? Or?
That sounds like leading the witness. and it happens to be true.
Right.
I started out long ago in the PC world. I was a journalist. I had my own newsletter called Release 1.0, and because I was a journalist, I didn't think it was appropriate to invest in things. But when I went over to Eastern Europe, I took a little bit of money, and the money was about 10 times more valuable in Eastern Europe, especially in Russia. So I invested over there even while I continued writing Release 1.0, and discovered I rather liked it, which is how that all started. But so I moved from.
When did you start publishing Release 1.0?
I bought it from Ben Rosen, who was the venture capitalist who invested in both Compaq and Lotus and was chairman of both of them. So he did have a conflict of interest, which is why he sold it to me. And if you ever talk about role models, so Ben was a former Morgan Stanley analyst. He was tall and good looking and intelligent and all this stuff. And he ran this little company. He was well known. But I looked at him and I thought, he runs this company. He's smart, but he's not measurably smarter than I am. I could do this too. And that's what I ended up doing. Partly because of that guy, who is great. I mean it nicely. But it always helps there's someone with whom you identify. And it doesn't necessarily need to be the same race or sex. It just needs to be someone that you consider to be someone you could do it too.
So was he both a mentor as well as a role model, or you didn't really work with him that closely to consider him to be a mentor?
He wasn't the mentoring kind. I mean, he was great, and I learned a lot from him, but he wasn't. My best bosses gave me a lot of freedom and a lot of responsibility, and I loved that. So, but I did learn a lot from watching him.
And did you get into, so you got into writing when you bought out one?
No, I got into writing when I did found something. It was the Dyson Gazette. I was 8 years old. Then I worked on the Harvard Crimson, which was a daily. I didn't go to class, but I did write a lot of movie reviews, and I had a great time. And then I worked for Forbes for 3 years. Which that was in the old days when they were a magazine, and they had really good editors, and they didn't have specialties. So I wrote about Westmoreland coal mine. I interviewed the CEO of American Motors, which existed at the time. Even though, being a New Yorker, I don't have a driver's license, he offered me a test drive for the weekend, and I couldn't take advantage.
So you have a pilot's license, but you have a driver's license?
No, I can't pilot a plane, I can pilot a spaceship. But not a car, you're right. I'm waiting for Sergey to give me one of those autonomous vehicles. Anyway, so journalism, Wall Street for 5 years, and
in equity research?
in equity research, yeah. So FedEx was my very first company, which is a model of a company that creates a market. It doesn't simply enter one. And then ended up doing tech investing, but I really didn't like the culture on Wall Street. And I also, there's this magic moment when some client said, wow, did you see what Data Point did last week? And I said, no. He said, well, the stock went up or down or something. I said, oh, I didn't notice. So I left.
What sort of role? There was, I think, Mark Cuban and the COO of Goldman and Valerie Jarrett were on a panel probably a couple of months ago, and I think it was CGI Americas, and Mark was sort of quite emphatic about the fact that actually capital markets doesn't serve the purpose that it should. And that essentially growth capital isn't really available to tech companies, for example, as it could be. So, you know, what's your perspective generally on the role of Wall Street?
Okay, well,
One second, Neil, make sure you speak. If you're turning your head away from the mic, speak into it for me. Cool. Thank you. Sorry.
they have training in that if you want.
I'm getting it on the job.
I'm going to keep you on the spot. We'll get it right soon. Go ahead.
Okay.
So I would half agree with him. I think Wall Street, I mean, derivatives, and for what it's worth, domain names, there are a lot of things that generate money that create absolutely no value. And
right.
Wall Street has become people rich and other people poorer versus putting money into companies. But I'm not sure, this minus 40, that will let it, I'm not sure that there's such a shortage of capital for startups. I think there's actually too many startups and not enough scaling. I mean, there will always be market imperfections, and you all, those of you who can't raise money, I don't mean you personally, etc. But by and large, there's a much bigger shortage of good people who know what they're doing to help you scale your startup. And part of the problem is people who would be perfectly good VPs of sales or project managers or group heads or what have you end up going and doing their own startup. And you know, the world wasn't designed to be totally efficient, but it also, at some point, redundancy is redundant and a bit wasteful.
So do you think that's an issue in terms of the limiting factor being on the operation side, or the limiting factor being, you know, investors that actually really want to build companies as opposed to speculate on?
I think in the U.S. the limit is really more, well, it's good people here, it's also good people in other markets, but both things are a much shorter supply. Here, you know, you've heard, you can't hire good tech people in the Valley or here in New York. And part of the reason is they're all doing their own startups, and many of them are doing either, you know, fashion stuff or video sharing. They're solving the kinds of problems that 22-year-olds have after they graduate. You know, I'd rather solve health or education or logistics in Africa or you know, monitoring factory conditions in Bangladesh.
And do you identify that as a social innovator or an impact investor, or just as a tech investor with a wider frame of reference?
You know, as a tech investor who likes to invest in useful things. One of my favorite self-descriptions is, if I were a maid, I'd like a dirty room. What's the point otherwise? And there are a lot of dirty rooms. Part of the challenge is you're much more effective disrupting an industry if you understand it first.
Yeah.
Do you do Q&A? I don't know.
I'll just go ahead. So, because
No, please.
Because it's a startup company, you know, people are doing a software company, people are doing internet startups. How do you think we can incent more, you know, young bright people to do harder companies that require capital, like, you know, energy or space?
You know, maybe it doesn't need young entrepreneurs. Maybe it needs seasoned entrepreneurs, like guys who worked at Boeing for 12 years and know what they're doing wrong, or people from the energy business. Yeah,
But they wouldn't get in, they wouldn't get into Y Combinator.
no, and maybe
They don't need it.
Maybe they don't need it, or maybe they would. I mean, there are. I guess it's wonderful when people can drop out of college and succeed in it, but I don't think that it's. And there are always going to be exceptions. I mean, I'm an exception, but as a rule, it's not so bad to know something before you do something. I'm actually doing my very first startup right now. I told Neil this. It has to do with health and communities, and one thing I want to do is go and fix school lunches, because they're terrible, and turn school lunch into something that's a combination of a nutrition class, and the little kids at the table, and the older kids chop the vegetables with adult supervision. And so I was explaining this to somebody, and this lady, she was very polite. She didn't say honey, but she said, actually, you may not realize it, but since your day, they've taken the kitchens out of most of the schools. And, you know, helps to know that sort of stuff if we're going to redo it. So when I talk to potential startups, I like it if they've actually gone and done something else for a while and they know what they want to disrupt. I'm not obviously a huge fan of formal education, but informal education is really useful. If only to learn how to manage, learn how to deal with life, how to get connections in your industry, so that then when you do your own startup, you know who to sell to, you know how it works.
Is that a factor though of, I mean, for example, customer development, or getting out of the building in the lean sense, or is that a factor of experience and industry experience or corporate as well?
It's kind of both. It's just, it doesn't hurt to spend a little time learning. I mean, the great thing about life and business these days is you're not going to be doing the same thing your whole career. So take a couple of years, try something out, learn how they do things and how they do things well. I'm involved with something the World Economic Forum runs called Fostering Entrepreneurship. And as chairman, I got them to change it to Fostering the Scaling of Entrepreneurship. One thing we're advocating for is not government funding or entrepreneur programs as much as corporations being more willing to buy from small companies, corporations who have training programs. Give a seat or two to your suppliers. If you have a lab that has spare lab space, let the pharma startup use your lab space. Corporations have huge resources. They often don't know what to do with them. They're surplus. That's exactly what little companies need. They need scale. They need access to the big companies' markets. They need training courses. In many of the countries I work in, they really don't get a good education. And so the large companies often have 6-month training programs for their people, which the small companies can't afford. So there's a far worse imbalance between the little guy and the corporations in other countries. But even here, you now see more corporate VC, and I think that's great.
And there's certainly an argument that corporations, I mean, there's a lot of wastage in terms of, or let's put it another a different way.
Dress codes.
Yeah, I mean, there's an opportunity cost with the fact that there's a disconnect between corporations and startups.
Yeah.
So, a lot of entrepreneurs would say, listen, I'm going to do an app, but it's simply because it's often just very hard to sell to corporates. And the other end of the spectrum, you'll have corporates that actually want to engender this sort of culture of entrepreneurship and innovation. And maybe entrepreneurship, but as much as there's initiatives of paid lip service to, they're not often followed through with.
They don't know how. Yeah, no, both sides are very imperfect.
Yeah.
And an app is often better than a job application, but it's a kind of wasteful, expensive job application.
Mm. Were there ever? I mean, I think in Germany there was probably. Maybe sort of sometime back in London as well, there was a sort of culture of apprenticeships and stuff like that you would do at an earlier age. And the conversation we had a couple of months ago with John Steinberg was, his feeling that his Columbia MBA was a terrific waste of money.
Yeah.
So how you foster entrepreneurship is possibly not through formal education, but at least exposure, as you say. And it's really just a question of how best to structure that. How to fund it, who funds it. Venture partners, I think, would be quite happy to say that they don't have to fund it if corporations would actually pick up the slack.
Yeah, I mean, I was Ben Rosen's apprentice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of different ways to do it, and we can sit here and tell everybody else how they should do it. The question for each of you is, how should I do it? And one thing is, you can go become an apprentice, even though it's got a different name, by working in a company that's in the field that you think is most interesting. And then after you work there for 2 years and hate the place, you can go do better. And maybe you'll work there for 2 years and discover you actually like it.
Well, I mean, that's probably an associate program, I would guess, but even...
No, I mean, without a program.
Sure, fair enough. What about it in an earlier stage, like 16, 17, 18, as opposed to 22, 23,
Yes.
24?
Well, there you have a different phenomenon of people just, you can start a company online when you're 16 without anybody noticing, and you can learn a ton. You can also learn a lot by playing World of Warcraft. About managing people, planning ahead, organizing things.
Scenario planning.
Yeah.
Sure. I think gaming is an industry. Have you invested?
No. I mean, there's gaming and there's gambling. Gambling, I think, is worse because it really exploits people with a weakness. Gaming, I don't think it should be illegal. Personally, I just think it's useless and I'm not interested. But that doesn't mean I think people shouldn't do it. It's just that's not how I would want to spend my time.
What about gamification?
Gamification is something totally different. That's a very effective model for behavior change, whether it's the behavior of buying stuff from my company or the behavior of being healthier or, I'm a big, maybe not victim, but gamification works very well for me in terms of airline miles, for example.
I think the Conservative government in the UK was trying to do. I shouldn't give the impression that I'm always in the UK because I am based here,
but you sound like it.
Yeah. But they called what we call gamification here. They called nudge. So nudge was this idea of actually sort of inducing or adapting behavior, positive behavior, and actually essentially leading people into behaviors that you wanted them to get to. So there were lots of policy scientists that informed government departments on how to get consumers and how to get the population to do better things, better practices.
And there's a book, I think, by Cass Sunstein or somebody called Nudge.
Yeah, it became quite successful. But what maybe just pushing a little bit on gaming just a little further though. What about educational or serious gaming?
That's wonderful.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, as I said, World of Warcraft can actually teach you useful skills. But I still think that solitaire is, it's pretty depressing to see people play solitaire.
Before healthcare, and we'll talk a little bit more about healthcare, but before healthcare, was there a specific industry that you really was interested in, either from a media aspect or from a investing aspect?
Well, before health and healthcare, it was enough to be an internet company because there were viewers. So I was in Flickr and Delicious and all kinds of random little advertising technology.
So you had your
annotation. As a journalist, of course, I was interested in text and content management and stuff like that.
So you did do kind of Web 2.0
stuff
as well?
Yeah. And it's just I started in Eastern Europe. And there I did Poland Online, which failed. I did a company called Scala, which is accounting software, which was successful.
Right.
And
do you speak Polish as well?
Dobrze, that's it. I speak Russian and German and French, but no Croatian either.
It's good, Dobrze, yeah. Actually, my Polish is quite good. Tell China. Why no more China?
Well, they don't tell you. And they tell you it is our right not to tell you. But I suspect, first of all, I'm on the board of the Sunlight Foundation, which is dedicated to government transparency, which is clearly a dangerous idea. I'm an investor in Anchor Free, which is the creator of Hotspot Shield, which is a private browsing tool. I've made comments about Google in China that the Chinese probably would not like, but it's pretty arbitrary. Rebecca McKinnon, there's lots of people who are far more dangerous than I to get in, but somebody evidently just didn't like me, and I'll wait 5 years. He will either be promoted up or have been purged. So,
what's your macro view on competitiveness here? That if you've got industry, infrastructure, innovation, and arguably there's some complications here with maybe the expense of education and maybe the bias towards financial services. And
so you mean New York specifically?
The States.
Or the U.S. overall?
Does that influence why you would actually hop on a plane and actually say, I'm going to bet on this market, I'm going to bet on this market? Do you think in those terms on a month, quarter by quarter basis?
No, as you can probably tell, I'm not really driven by ROI, or I would have had a much more organized career. I go to these places because I find them interesting, and then with the amount of money I have, which is not very much in the scheme of things, you can't invest in countries. You can invest only in individual companies. So it's pretty random. I have strong feelings, though, that, I'm American. I love being American, but I don't think that we have some special right to have higher salaries and higher standards of living than people around the rest of the world. So I think this immigration issue, I would have framed it differently, but fundamentally, 50 or 100 years from now, people in the United States are not going to be being paid more than people elsewhere for the same work, more or less. And it's something we need to recognize. We need to get better educated if we want to keep being better paid.
Yeah.
And of course, it's a challenge because it's not the 6-year-olds that are making the decisions about the education system. It's being imposed on them by people, both voters and governments, who are incredibly short-sighted. And also, they're short-sighted, short-term thinking, and completely deluded about how good they are versus the rest of the world.
I'm curious, how do you work with startups, besides the typical board meeting,
like how involved do you get with the startups that you work with? Almost a day-to-day basis or weekly?
That varies a lot. I mean, there are some where, you know, you put in the money, you talk to them a few times, then 3 years later, you get an email, either
It's good or bad?
they've disappeared or they've actually sold out to somebody. Others, and it's kind of depends partly on me and partly on them. I I always invest in them thinking I'm going to stay involved because it's something I'm excited in, I believe in, whatever.
Do you take board seats?
I do take board seats, but I have too many right now.
Okay.
And yeah, when you have a board seat, you're responsible. Otherwise, you may have a feeling of responsibility and so forth, but it's the board where you actually are responsible. So it will vary. It will depend if there's someone else who can be more helpful than I am. There are cases where something needs to be done and nobody else does it, so then I'll get more involved. There are other cases where they have 3 perfectly good board members and I'm really not adding very much value. So now, of course, it's more the health ones, and to some extent, this thing I'm starting, Hiccup, is an attempt to provide a way for all these companies I've invested in who are offering some kind of health or healthy behavior to actually get pilot programs. I mean, it's not directly that, but there's a real need for all these healthy behavior tools to actually be used, and it's happening a lot slower than I would like. I mean, even, it's worth pointing out, there's probably more video sharing than there are healthy behavior tools, but there are probably a few too many healthy behavior tools as well.
What do you think of kind of the innovation culture now happening in at the federal level with people that top part? Is that something that some of the startups that you've invested in have directly benefited from, or not?
Probably benefited indirectly. I mean, I'm really glad our government supports this stuff. I think that's great. And there are CMS, the medical services grants and so forth. But in the end, I trust investors and I trust the market more than I trust the government. Not because government people are bad or stupid, but because government should be risk averse, and when it's not, it invests in Solyndra and gets hammered for it. Yeah. VCs, if they make 8 mistakes and 2 successes, people remember the successes. If the government makes 1 mistake, everybody remembers the mistake. And so it's not what government should be doing. I think they should be spending their money educating people and figuring out health care, and there are enough more Cubans and people like that around who are ready to invest. That's different in certain other countries, but that's the U.S. I'm going to let you either talk or call on people.
Sure. We'll do that.
Neil, before you guys do questions, can you repeat the question when you answer it? Just repeat it in your answer, because we can't hear them.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah.
Sure.
Go ahead and then
You
I'll
mentioned your time horizon or short-term thinking is the problem. So, and admittedly, at say a congressional level, that's clearly an issue. But theoretically, at least at the executive level, they have the government in general has the capacity for longer-term horizons. So, wouldn't that actually go against your argument there? Now, yes, maybe picking Solyndra, for example, is a great example, but of those investments, 95% of them are doing well or come out ahead. Now, perhaps when those things don't go well, they've been writing good contracts that the government now owns that property and can be bought by Russians. But I think the government can definitely play that long-term role that you were talking about.
Well, the government, so it was a rather long question about long-term and short-term. The government can definitely play a long-term role, but it does get into trouble when it makes mistakes in a way that the private sector doesn't. And I think the government can play a wonderful long-term role in things that are clearly needed and not innovative, like education and healthcare, and that will give people more ability to solve their own problems.
Well, I guess there's a difference between capacity development and direct investing.
Yeah, and infrastructure also.
Exactly. Yeah.
More, more trains, more bridges that don't fall down, more.
Being able to commute between New York and LA in 4 hours.
Yeah, or I mean, what Elon Musk is going to announce in 2 weeks, whatever it is.
Yeah. You have a question, go ahead.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that there's a flood in startups, and I happen to believe that as well. However, do you believe that's a necessary evil, considering that we're essentially walking into the event horizon? And what's going to happen in the next 20 to 30 to 50 years, 100 years, is virtually unknown. This technology is underpinning everything that we do right now. So these failures to be seen a necessary instructional education base for what happens next, especially the failures.
Yeah. So the question is.
Failure tolerance.
Pardon?
Failure tolerance.
Yeah. The question is, don't we need some failures? I think we need some, but I really don't think we need 20 video sharing companies. And no, I don't want the government to go and say there's a quota, but just as an observer, I see more redundancy than I think is useful. I'm a big believer in failure. I invest in lots of things that fail, and I consider that the cost of investing, not losses or personal failures. But I try to invest in things that are different, not redundant.
Do you think that venture, sorry, I'm going to come back in a second. Do you think that venture partners could do more in terms of, either discouraging kind of also around some copycat models and actually sort of getting people to take bolder bets?
Absolutely. VCs, and some of my best friends are VCs, and of course, any VC I know, I wasn't talking about you, but a lot of them, they tend to invest in the same things. There's safety in numbers. So I'll tell you the worst story I heard. There was this woman I invested in who's doing very well. It's a medical sort of company, and she went and talked to a VC, and he said she had just gotten accepted to Y Combinator, and he said, "Oh, Y Combinator, that's not very good." And she said, "Why?" He said, "Well, you shouldn't have to need that. Max Levchin didn't go through Y Combinator." And I could sort of hear him thinking, and besides, you don't look like Max Levchin. There's just this, it's probably safer. So if you read some of the books like Nudge or Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, all these things, you get punished a lot more for making a mistake that was unusual, like investing in this strange woman who needed Y Combinator versus, another guy who went to Harvard. Well, he went to Harvard. Who could have predicted he would have failed? So people tend to make these safe decisions. They invest in people they know. When you hire, especially when you're starting, it's always easier to hire people you know. You trust them. In Russia, you know where they live. So people are risk averse, but that leads to a lot of redundancy and failure because things are too similar rather than failure because things are too innovative or new.
And isn't that a contradiction? Okay, so we've got 2 questions coming up. But isn't that a contradiction for the venture space? Almost by definition, there's a logical self-contradiction or internal contradiction there.
Yeah.
Which I think is a shame. I mean, I started off in kind of the SAP Oracle world, and the idea before those companies came up was in the enterprise space. No one ever got fired for buying IBM, and it's fine to kind of have that attitude in enterprise. But I think in the early stage innovation space, it would be again a terrific opportunity for us if venture partners do the same idea.
And they do, and it is. And then the guys who are more creative tend to do better because they do go out and fund the things that are more original.
So how do you find outliers? Or how do they find you?
They're everywhere.
Okay.
They really are. And it's the other thing, it's worth saying, people focus way too much on the idea and not enough on the ability to build a business. Again, if you have an idea, it's an indication of what you're about, what interests you. The chances that the thing you started with will be what you're actually selling 2 years from now are very low. So what I need to invest in is your capability to change, your commitment to the market or the vision, not your commitment to the specific idea. And then, honestly, your ability to build a team, to build a set of processes, to recognize maybe that you don't want to do that and go do another one and hire somebody who's better than you are at running a business. But a VC wants to build a company, and that is a very, very different thing from an app.
We've got 2 questions we'll take.
Okay, so you use the mic here, so for the video.
Go ahead. Oh, okay.
Yeah, so your comments about kind of the role of government and specifically in education prompted a question, so apologies to the group if we go into that for a second. But I think in the education world and people interested in reform, there's 2 different arguments, right? One is around raising the standards overall, and one is around kind of empowering education entrepreneurs to start charter schools, et cetera, to challenge the system. Would love to get your thoughts on the Common Core.
I don't know enough about the Common Core specifically to comment. The most exciting thing I saw last week was a company called, I think it's Dreambox, that provides mastery learning. I mean, there's a huge difference between, content is online courses, and then things that deal with the process of helping a child to learn, understanding what the child has learned, what they need to learn, sort of bringing them through the path to mastery of the material rather than, they read all this stuff, they're ready for the next unit. That's where the real win is. But education is also being inspired by a teacher or a role model. It's learning how to work with other children. I mean, my idea of school lunch was not just nutrition. It was also how to collaborate on making a meal, how to learn about nutrition, how to learn about ordering supplies, using math to figure out how many eggs you need for the omelet for 70 children.
I guess how to recognize food from its source ingredients, which
Yeah.
I would imagine that many children don't know how to do
Well,
right now.
there are a lot of kids who don't know what meat is.
Right.
You know, like,
Well, they wouldn't know from
This
chicken
is
and nuggets,
meat.
yeah. Right. Yeah. What did you think of Jamie Oliver and what he was trying to do there?
I think Jamie Oliver and a lot of these food people, in some way they're great, but many of them are more focused on natural ingredients and local than they are on nutritional value and frankly on the ability to scale. Yeah, you just can't have kitchen gardens everywhere. I talked to a guy from Pepsi. It's actually pretty scary. If everybody were to eat, I don't know, 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day or something like what we really should, we'd have to devote 3 times more land to agriculture than we have available in the U.S. So, pretty scary. But there's a lot we can do simply to take out the processed ingredients. And it's just, Jamie Oliver is really nice, but it's not dealing with the fundamental scaling industrial problems.
But I guess what you just said is that therefore there's a great portion of the country which is functionally malnourished.
Oh yeah, and I want to change that, but not, I think there's a way to do it more scalably than, I want to bring the bottom up rather than enrich the top. The top can take care of itself. Yeah, there's a contradiction. If everybody ate well, it's unsustainable. So, but that would be a nice problem to have. We could figure it out. We can start creating aquatic gardens. I mean, I have nothing personally against genetically modified food. What I do have a problem with is processed food. And you know, the original 3D printing, I think, is baloney. It comes out of a tube, and it's laid down. You know, maybe that joke didn't work, but anyway, we can grow real food in vats. We don't necessarily need to do it in old-fashioned farms with horses or even tractors. And we can create healthy food. The problem with our food is that it's full of fat and sugar, and it's processed so that it will last forever, and it's addictive. And I should stop talking because... But anyway, this is something I would like to solve.
Wow, okay. A lot of questions, all right. We'll go with you, just right here.
Hello. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the space and aviation kind of startup scene,
Okay.
and also some of your investments. I know you were in X-Corp, for instance.
Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm an investor and actually on the board of Esther, which is the company most people haven't heard of that is actually going to be competing with Virgin Galactic for the near space flights where you go up and you spend 15 minutes weightless. The Virgin Galactic version is really nice. You're sort of with your family, who of course have to pay $250K a piece, in a kind of living room. You float around and it's very luxurious. And the X-Core version is $100K, and it's just you and the pilot. So you can't bring your family. It's just one of you. It's extreme sports. It's far less luxurious. So they're very different, and of course we all hope that people will want to do both of them.
But they launch around the same time.
Yeah, and they're both kind of racing, but at the same time nobody wants to go before they're ready. I get to do the last test flight X-Core does before it goes commercial. So in a sense, I'm the Richard Branson of X-Core. But on a broader level, the new space industry is a really interesting marketplace. Until recently, it was a bunch of rich guys who had their own companies. Going back to what I said earlier, they hired people they knew. These companies, by and large, were not well managed. This is different from SpaceX, which has really professional people, many of them from the aerospace industry. But it wasn't a market. It was a set of kind of billionaire-funded projects. Now it's becoming an actual market. In many ways, thanks to Elon Musk, he's making it look interesting to institutions. There's two people in the near space business. There's Planetary Resources, which is going to do asteroids, ironically, not planets initially. There's a couple of moonshot people taking people to the moon. I'm involved with Golden Spike. There's Bigelow Aerospace, who's going to put up a non-international, privately owned space station so that when people go up, they have a place to go, because the International Space Station is expensive and complicated. So suddenly you have a market with different players in it, competing, positioning themselves one against the other, and it's really exciting.
So this is a plethora of moonshots, not just one.
Yeah, but they're looking less like moonshots. They're looking more like engineering, and that's what's really exciting. It still takes a long time, and it's still an elite sport, and it's still certainly not your standard institutional investors, but it's becoming an operating market with visibility and competition and benchmarks. And they're bringing in real management from outside. So that's exciting. I mean, personally, I want to retire on Mars, and this is half a joke, but not really. I don't want to do it too soon, which is fortunate. I do think it's humanity's destiny to keep moving out, and
moving up and out.
Up and out, yeah. And synthetic biology is going to be tremendously important to creating an atmosphere on Mars. And at some point, I do think we'll be living there, and maybe once we've fixed Mars, we can go back and fix Earth.
So we shouldn't worry too much about environmentalism here if we avoid the prospect.
No, we should still worry about the environment here, because it's going to be a while till Mars is a workable backup.
Wow. Okay, you had a question.
There's
okay.
just so you know.
Sure. Okay. Well, if you don't have a question,
We should have them bid.
Go right ahead. Sorry.
Thank you. Switching gears a little bit, I'd love to ask you about the Jobs Act. Your perspective on it. Is it a good thing, bad thing?
My perspective on it, to the extent I've really focused on it, is that it's probably a bad idea. I've traveled enough and been around enough in places from Wall Street to the domain name system that, you know,
You're talking about ICANN.
yeah. Well, the domain, yeah. I love my friends, I love business, I love everybody I know, but there are a lot of sleazy people out there, and I think sometimes people who are idealistic and want the best for the world forget how vulnerable they are to bad people coming in and destroying what was a good idea. If you ever talk to somebody from eBay who's really inside, ask them how much money they spend on fraud. Not paying for fraud, but fraud detection, fraud avoidance. There's nothing like that in the Jobs Act, and I think it will help good people get funded, but will help a lot of sleazebags get funded. It will cause people to invest in things they don't understand, and something that was very nobly motivated, I think, is not necessarily going to work out.
So you think there could be a corruption of entrepreneurship because of inexperienced and possibly badly motivated people with liquidity?
Yeah, I mean, it won't corrupt the good entrepreneurs, but there will be a lot of corrupt bad people there, and there will be some bad thing that will happen and it will get tarnished. It's just, there's a reason we have market regulation, even though it doesn't work very well, unfortunately.
But is your misgiving about entrepreneurs being taken for a ride or investors being taken for a ride?
I think in both directions. And people raising money who are, they're not trying to cheat, but they just, you know, cynical as I am about VCs, they do add some value.
Due diligence?
Well, not just due diligence, but advice, and what angels should add as well. I mean, if you have 500 investors, none of whom's responsible, and the company needs some oversight, supervision, advice, they're not going to get it, and that's unfortunate.
How much of that, but even at this stage, you know, AngelList is a terrific platform and serves a really important function. But I mean, there's been many debates on AngelList, on Quora, about social proof and about momentum investing, just, you know, basically following someone that you like. And then applying cash to that model.
Yeah.
So that also suggests that either a suspension or even an absence of due diligence that is also not particularly good.
Yeah. I'm less concerned about the due diligence part than
the follow-on guidance.
The follow-on guidance, the decision making. Yeah, I've seen enough companies go off the rails, and it's not that all investors are that smart, but again, I think there's too much focus on money and not enough on the other parts of both investing and running a company. You need more than money, and that's why I like. You know, if you have really good customers, they'll give you some of that feedback that you might not get from your investors.
Sure. A quick follow-up on that. I felt for a long time that that entrepreneurship was best fostered by people who'd done it themselves, and who'd actually sort of build businesses and could actually be be both sort of mentors and could give me some advice about organizational dynamics, about business development, about building the right team and not just cutting a check. And sometimes would actually bias towards actually taking a smaller check and more guidance than a larger check and none. Is there any way, though, of finding more of those people because they're not necessarily that easy to find, and I think a lot of people would probably just take the money when it's available.
Yeah. Well, again, that's one reason to go work in industry, and then rather than finding someone you don't know who seems to be perfect, you find someone who was your customer, who knows you, knows the industry you're in because she's in it as well. The reason personal contacts, when they work well is not, there's the, oh yeah, my children rode horses together, but there's also, we're in the same business. We've bought from one another. We've watched this person do other things. And that's good, but it also, and it means that the other person is likely to know the business that you're in.
Expertise on growth is different though from growth capital. So let's say it's easy to get on with the first run, maybe C, possibly Series A, but there is possibly a crisis in terms of actually getting that further money, that B round, that C round, or even an IPO at a lower level, like at a 70 to 100 million, as opposed to whatever is now expected in the IPO market of a tech company. So what are your thoughts on that in terms of growth capital?
Well, I think that is part of the problem. I mean, right now, the last thing I read was there are too many ad tech companies.
In New York?
Well, probably in the world. But so they got funded, and because they got funding, they were able to grow without making a profit. They might have gotten one or two customers. But then there's kind of a glut of them, and you can, depending on which business you're in, you can sell to one of 5 big players, and then so when a
Do you source for WPP?
yeah. So if a person is alive and they're not ready to die, they're young, it's really sad if they die. If a company is alive, but there's 6 other companies doing precisely the same thing, it's not such a tragedy if they die. I mean, some individual's hopes are dashed, but the people can go work elsewhere where they're probably short of precisely those kinds of people. It goes back to what I said earlier about too many startups. I mean, it's not just at the seed stage.
Follow on.
Can you use the mic here? Hold on.
To follow on that, I'm in the health IT field. My roots are in the nonprofit sector, where the problem with too many startups, and not enough scaling is, I would say, 100 times worse. I have a database of 7,000 cancer support services, and I would say almost none of them are truly unique. And they're all competing for the same funds, for the same foundation. And I'm often wondering, who are the people who are funding these and not saying, well, did you know there's another sarcoma organization that's really similar? And it strikes me as so many of the things that are happening in the investment world, there seems to be crossover in thoughts and thinking that is happening in the foundation world, but there doesn't seem to be any conversation between those worlds and kind of coming together. I'm wondering if you've seen any, or if you've had thoughts of this, or any solutions.
No, and the foundation world is even worse because there's no profit motive or accountability that gets people to merge or stops them being funded. And I mean, there's different kinds of charities. If you serve lunch at church every day and feed hungry people, that's good. I mean, you could still argue perhaps you should teach them how to cook or whatever, but that's useful and not redundant, even though there's another church feeding other people down the road. They're both doing something valuable, though they could probably do it better if they were merged and more efficient. And that's the sad part. There's no drive to, or almost no drive to being more effective, more productive, whatever, in charity. And that's why a lot of people who are charitably inclined are now saying, I want to do impact investing. I want to. And so there's cancer services, then there's cancer cures, and that's even worse because people have this one cure that they believe is the cure, and so they will fund it long past the point at which it's proven to be ineffective. And so many drugs, you know, if you look at the studies, they're all above average because the ones that are below average aren't published.
One more question? Yeah, one more? One more question? One more?
Sure.
Thanks. I actually want to change directions kind of a lot. So you have one investment in your portfolio that really stood out to me as being kind of really an outlier, and it's Fancy. So could you talk a little bit about how that happened? Sure. What the hell's going on there?
Yeah. Okay, so Fancy, which at the time was called Thing D, began as a registry of things. And if that, so that should explain it all. But I'm fascinated by the notion of registries, you know, just registries of things, of services, databases. So I'm an investor in factual. And when it began, Thing D was probably closer to factual than it is to the sort of Pinterest fab consumer kind of thing that it is now. So it pivoted because it was a for-profit company and the other investors decided that it would be more profitable if it became the Fancy. So that's why.
So how do you feel about that now?
You know, how shall I say, it's certainly not my worst mistake. And nobody promised me what it would be. I invested in something, it changed. Whatever. It's probably good I wasn't on the board because I would have been unhappier, and they probably made the right decision for it as a business. Yeah, there's a number of businesses I invested in that turned out doing something quite different. And many others that turned out dead, so whatever.
I'll check in with you quickly. Are you okay?
Oh yeah, fine.
One question at the back, and then we'll go in this line.
Are you staying awake? He came in from London. This guy is at 1 a.m.
I'm good, thank you.
Hi, Esther. So I volunteer for a nonprofit that focuses on bringing foreign startups to New York City to help them expand their company, their market, so on and so forth. And I'm just curious how you feel about that, because it's sort of a catch-22. I mean, we're giving companies the opportunity to expand and grow, but we're stealing them from their home countries, which are then suffering. So just curious. And I don't know if you know us, we're Venture Out in New York. I don't know if you've heard of us, but that's what we do. So.
Well, I could say you're the devil, but you know, if people really want to come to New York, I will help them if I can. I've advised many Russian companies, in particular, stay at home. There's enough really interesting problems in Russia. You don't need to go to the U.S. where you didn't go to high school with anybody, and you don't. It's kind of like the argument I made earlier about go into business first before you disrupt it. And it depends a lot on what kind of thing you have. If it's strong technology, it makes more sense to come to the U.S., but probably often to go to Silicon Valley rather than New York. For practical purposes, people in other countries who want to come to the U.S., they hear about the successes. They don't hear about all the failures. And so I think they have a really misled view of how difficult it is, especially if you are. I mean, again, if you go to VC and you have an Indian accent, it's probably a plus. But if you have a Croatian accent and you don't know anybody, and so it's hard. Yet, some of the best successes are foreigners, you know, including Sergey Brin and Philippe Kahn and all kinds of people. So, yeah, I mean, once they're here, help them. But I would advise most of them to stay in a market that they know better and do something there.
You can go ahead. So basically, I have a startup company. It's financial services, technology, and investments. The thing I was thinking about, and like you said, this kind of company can make a lot of money. But one of the things is, if I'm going to make so much money, I want to give back, type of thing, right? And I thought about putting in part of the marketing material, or whatever I'm going to bring to the investors, something about reinvesting in the community, reinvesting the profits into making, just to do good with the money, right? But I didn't know how that would be perceived and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Is that a good thing to put on there, or is that something that's going to be like, something's wrong with these guys, it'll never work out?
Okay, well here's my personal advice. I would say if you want to do good, go do good. Don't go, why waste your time doing financial services?
Because you can do more good.
But, and you can, I mean, if you're good, you can do a lot. If you want to make a lot of money and then spend it yourself, fine. As an investor, I want you focused on the business. If I don't want to invest in your business, if I want to do good, I'll go invest in somebody that's doing good. So I think you're giving a really mixed message for practical purposes.
What you were saying earlier is...
Yeah, take the mic.
What you were saying earlier is there are investors looking for someone that's not going to add value, right?
Yeah.
So what value does these financial services? I mean, it's just making money on
exactly. And so I wouldn't invest in you. I would wait for
right.
you to come with your second company
that
was
so
doing good. So I think, but practically people...
It wouldn't be something that people would even be interested in that. I mean, it wouldn't be something...
Saying we're going to do good with this first financial services company, no. You'll just attract the wrong people who will be disappointed if you make a ton of money. It's like everything else. You need to be focused, and you need to either be focused on making a ton of money, or focused on doing good, or focused on some particular market. But
that's just something that's going to be down the road.
Yeah, I mean, investors, if they want to be diversified, they will diversify by picking different companies rather than by picking one company that does 3 different things.
Could I a quick follow-up on that, if I may? I mean, there's a difference between maybe sort of setting up a check cashing company or a pawn shop versus...
Pawn shop or pawn shop?
Excuse my balance. Versus a Kiva or something like that. So, you can, so that's one thing that, you can't, there's no point actually just, even though there are lots of misgivings, I'm sure many of them valid, related to financial services and the toxicity within that industry, but you can still actually disrupt it and actually have decent progressive models within financial services. And you can do that as a business, and you don't necessarily have to do that by actually then saying you're going to commit 10% of your toxic business model into then philanthropy. All right, you can actually just do that by being a better company. And related to that, I guess I wanted to ask more. What do you think of sort of evolutions of corporate governance in terms of that you can do well by doing good, or you can establish a B Corp? Does that work? What are your views on companies that want to try and do that?
Okay, well, I suddenly realized I'm actually an investor in a company called PayPerks that it's like salary cards for people at the low end of the salary scale who don't have their own credit cards. And I guess that's financial services innovation. The point of it, yeah, it's for profit, but it has a different motive. And that would be a good example. Corporate governance, and it goes, I mean, it's sort of what I said earlier. If the moment you take investors, you owe the investors to try to be profitable I mean, so take the question of fancy. What they did was absolutely appropriate because I was a small investor. They didn't make any guarantees to me that they were going to do a registry of things rather than a more consumer-y luxury site. If you want to have a company, the double bottom line to me just fundamentally seems like a conflict in the end. So you need investors that believe in your mission. I'm on the board of Meetup, and we're for-profit, we make a profit, but we're not trying to become Twitter. We're not trying to go public and blow people's socks off. We're trying to provide a really valuable service to people who pay for it, and our investors get that. That to me is more important than a kind of legalistic double bottom line, or Pierre Omidyar, who wanted to do good, realized there were too many restrictions on his nonprofits and said, screw this, I'm just going to invest for profit and invest in things I believe in. And he's an investor in Meetup, by the way. So. And
Meetup is what, a classic sequel? It's not
yeah, no, it's a normal for-profit. We have Union Square, which believes in our mission. They also are an investor in Twitter.
So there's no idea of the founders kind of shortchanging the investors, just actually aligning their investors with their objectives.
Yeah, they are motivated. Any good company, I mean, the reality is treating your employees well is good business long-term. It might not be good business short-term. But when you're a small company and you don't have public investors, you need to find investors that are aligned with that. And if you go public, this is what Larry and Sergey did with Google, and I would say it hasn't totally persisted.
In terms of
there are discussions about that.
Their structure, though, of question set. I wonder why. I'm impressed by, let's say, Google.com, Google.org, Google X, Google Ventures.
Right. And they did it by their shareholder structure.
And I think it's fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder why there aren't actually more. You don't necessarily have to cross the $100 billion threshold to do it, but why there isn't more evolution in the corporate structure that allows other similarly well-capitalized companies to do that.
Well, they are allowed to. They just don't.
Yes.
I mean, but so take for example the Washington Post.
Yeah.
Which I believe, it's again the family controls a lot. So there may be somebody here who knows more than I do, but I think they're not run rapaciously for profit, and certainly in the days of Kay Graham, they were run specifically for the holy grail of journalism. And
was it Buffett an investor in Washington?
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's more strong and principled management with a mission than
corporate governance.
Yeah,
in terms of
but
legal
you
structure.
do need to deal with the control issues, and as long as the stockholders know what they're doing and they're willing to have, whether it's the Graham family or Larry and Sergey, keep control, I think that's great. And then the company can do more than simply maximize profits for Carl Icahn.
Yeah, that sounds like, in the entertainment industry, you call it kind of artistic integrity or creative integrity, but basically it's sort of a founder of a company saying, this is what I stand for, take it or leave it, this is basically what I'm building and I stand by it and I'm doing it for the long term, and I'll wait to find the investor aligned to that, as opposed
and sell
to,
the stock if you don't like it.
Indeed. As opposed to meld to maybe, either shorter term or, either egregious terms, short term, or whatever it is that actually compromises those ideals. So would you basically advocate founder entrepreneurs to actually just do that more often and stick to their guns?
Personally, I would. So I'm extremely lucky. I can do what I like. I make enough money on having been lucky in the past. You guys are all, one way or another, upper middle class or got there. There are a lot of people who will take any job because they need the money. They've got children at home who need money. So it's easy to say people should live only for principle, but the fact is, if you can afford to, you'll be much happier. It really is, it's just more fun.
And you should be doing this because you want to, and not
Yeah.
because,
I mean, nobody ever, when people are close to dying and they get interviewed, they don't regret that they didn't make enough money. They regret that they didn't spend enough time with their families or whatever.
Is that an argument you could make to the market?
No, not effectively.
Is there anything you could do to, you know, I mean, you hear so many mass layoffs. We were talking about Google.com.
I mean,
just to appease. I mean, you said if you don't like the stock, sell it. Well, that is what we see happening.
Yeah. You can remind people of it. I mean,
remind the traders.
No, ignore them. I mean,
well, they do. Their decisions make
people on Wall Street self-select, but it never hurts to remind people. You know, in a sense, it's my duty as someone who's sitting up in front of people to remind them that they weren't put on Earth to optimize their earnings. Whatever they were put on Earth for, they should figure out what it was and do that rather than live by someone else's version of what success is.
You really want to ask a question? Go ahead.
Yes. Well, I'm also involved in a health tech company, very early stage. We have a beta test location for us to actually try out a solution. But the question of the double bottom line still lingers around here, because the main pertinent, the main doctor who's involved in this actually likes to do good for the hospital and for the area to save money. But we who are involved would like to make a profit out of it as well and scale it to other places to save their money as well. Now, in this model, do you see a double model conflict for investors? Because, I mean, funding is very typical in this kind of situations where there are hospitals and grants and government involvement, because it's clearly a great idea to save a lot of money in terms of transfusion and blood and things like that.
Okay. The problem isn't the double bottom line. The problem is it's very hard to get funding in the health industry because it's so complicated and incentives are so badly aligned. If the challenge is getting people to believe that you can scale and that they will in fact make money in a world where, you know, I don't know your particular business or business model, but your challenge is to prove that it can work and that it's profitable, and then you'll get investors.
Yeah.
And I mean, in the end, most things in health, if they work, are for the good of humanity. What's wrong with the system is that because of the way healthcare works in the U.S., things that do good may be over-purchased, overutilized. Things that, companies, drugs that do good for some people and don't do good for other people may be prescribed anyway. But the purpose of most medical technology is, in fact, to do good for people. The challenge is a system that misuses them and so forth. So, in your case, I think everything's perfectly aligned. You have a problem getting funding in a market that's incredibly inflexible and hostile to innovation and all these other things.
So what is your advice for seeking funding?
Well, my advice is said with great trepidation, come up to me afterwards and maybe we can spend 2 minutes.
Can I get two quick questions in, and then we'll take a vote on how we maybe make the next few minutes less formal. But I think we're literally running out of video space. Okay, so one question I wanted to ask was, have you been tempted at all to actually just go straight for either larger tranches of money or institutional money to basically set up the $100 billion, the $1 billion hedge fund? $1 billion venture fund.
It has occurred to me because I like to think about all kinds of possibilities. But no, I have never been tempted. The great thing about what I do is when I make mistakes, I don't need to apologize to anybody. And I can invest in things that I think are cool without having to explain them. Yes, that means I have very little leverage, and what I do often is try and bring other investors in. But I have so much freedom, and I value it. So, no.
And last question then. PC Forum, I was amazed that you'd ran this for 25 years. And it wrapped up in, 2007? So a quick question. If you were, for whatever reason, to bring it back, how, what would, for example, without being specific, what would PC4 in 2014 look like? How would you curate it?
So PC Forum is the conference I ran for 25 years that, in its day, when the industry was much smaller, got the industry together. It was not a trade show. It was not for consumers. It was not for commercial buyers. It was really for the industry to self-identify. And it's something that, if I were to bring it back, I might actually do it for new space rather than, it began as personal computers and it ended up as platforms for computing. But if I were to do it now, I'd certainly have Google and Microsoft and Facebook. But the topics, the world has changed. I mean, first of all, it would be far more international than it was even back then. And at that point, I did try to make sure that we had more non-US people than you would find at any other conference.
Did they all take place in New York?
No. So anybody who ever wants to come talk to me about they took place in places where you had to go there and then you stayed there. So Tucson, Palm Springs, not where you come in and then you go out to lunch with your customer. So people would come and they would mingle with one another. They couldn't go anywhere else. They brought their families, which made them behave slightly better than they might have otherwise. And my family came, which was about 20 people, 5 sisters and all that, and their children. It would certainly talk about some of the things you've talked about today. The funding climate, the redundancy. I do a lot on synthetic biology and 3D printing and some of the newer stuff. Honestly, I think healthcare and education are the most interesting markets. Good or not, they're the ones where the challenges are real and worth addressing. So I'd probably, the MOOC people, Daphne Kohler, I definitely have something about mapping and visualization. I would try not to have a panel on big data because it would be implicit in almost everything. And I'd definitely get Sergey and Larry to bring a couple of self-driving cars so that I could try that.
And where would you have it? Tucson was a great place, probably Tucson, but some other examples would be, I was going to say Boulder, but Boulder actually now probably has too many startups there, and again, it would be too much in and out. So I might try to do something more original. So Chattanooga, or it's very hard to find a hotel. You want a hotel that will fit everybody, but nobody else, because the worst thing is being one of 10 people in a hotel where there's a shoe convention and you're the only people who. So you need to take over. It's not going to be Vegas.
No, it's not going to be Vegas. You take over the whole hotel, and they treat everybody really well because you're the main source of business, and they put in good Wi-Fi for you, and it has to have a great swimming pool. Thank you all very much.